I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe, sound, and above all, healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions, at least for now, on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm very pleased to host the inestimable Mary B. McCord, currently the Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a visiting professor at Georgetown Law School. Formerly, Mary served as the Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice. Mary, welcome, or I should say welcome back to Carnegie Connects. Way back in March of 2021, several months after January 6th, you helped us unravel, along with two other colleagues, Rachel Kleinfeld and Mark Ginsburg, helped us unravel the rise of far-right extremism in America. I must say that of all the Carnegie Connects we've done, I find the sessions devoted to America to be the most complex and worrisome. The landscape is a troubling one. I'm a great believer in the regenerative and recuperative powers of the American Republic. I think a compelling argument can be made that we've been through worse at various points in our history, but I don't think, and I think this is the critical point, we've ever quite been here the way we've been today. You have what the political sciences call pernicious polarization, countries divided into mutually antagonistic political camps, which have morphed into informing the way people look at their identities and their social networks. I saw one poll in 1960 when you asked Americans whether or not they would object if their sons or daughters married members of the opposite party. 6% said they would object. Today, that same poll, Gallup or Pew, I think it was Gallup, 45% of Democrats, 35% of Republicans would object if their sons or daughters married a member of the opposition party. You have a political system which is under incredible stress and has failed to accommodate the sort of consensus that we need to address a lot of issues: abortion, guns, immigration, climate. And I voted for Republicans and Democrats and worked for Republicans and Democrats, but you have a political system in which one of our parties seems to have elevated the notion of undermining the American political system and confidence of the voter in our electoral politics, and it even seeks to find ways to shape the vote counting process. Sitting members of Congress engage in conspiracy theory and political hate speech. White nationalist groups, even though, as you yourself have pointed out, are banned by federal and state law. Paramilitary organizations are barred by statute, continue to operate, presumably with some impunity. And then you have, of course, guns, specifically long guns, automatic weapons with high-capacity magazines that result in these terrible mass shootings, even though they only constitute about 1% of gun fatalities in this country. So, Mary McCord, let me ask you, is my painting the landscape unnecessarily negative? If so, how? And then how would you categorize the basic or prioritize the threats to our domestic security today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And it's nice to be back and return and talk about these topics. But the topics are really dark. I mean, you paint a very, very dire picture, and I don't really disagree with anything that you laid out in terms of the landscape. There's no question. I mean, we've had a civil war in our history, right? And we are not in a civil war right now. So we have certainly been through, worse and deadlier times. But certainly in my lifetime, and I'm not going to say how old I am, but in my lifetime, this is the most polarized I've seen us. And this is the most dangerous in terms of the threats to our democracy that I've experienced. And I think it's a result of a few things. I've long, I was obviously in leadership at the Department of Justice and National Security doing counterterrorism work. That was like 2014 to 2017, when for a good portion of that time, ISIS was one of the major threats in terms of a national security threat. This is a foreign terrorist organization that declared its own caliphate in June of 2014. Before that, I was a prosecutor for 20 years, a federal prosecutor. So I've certainly had a lot of experience with all kinds of different threats to public safety as well as national security. So we always have problems with violence, and some of that as political violence, whether it's international terrorism or domestic terrorism or domestic extremist violence. What I think is so different now is that the political violence has sort of collapsed into the threats to our democratic processes here from within domestically. So it's no longer that, and we can get to the topic of lone wolves. It's no longer that you have some fringe extremists who have grievances. They have easy, ready access to incredibly lethal semi-automatic assault style rifles. And they have, when they are so motivated, the ability to inflict damage, severe damage on groups of people, including through, mass shootings, injuries, deaths, and real terrorism. You don't have just that. You have that in conjunction with doing it to further the erosion of our democratic processes, because thanks to things like the Stop the Steal movement, election denial, the fraud, the fraudulent claims, the fraudulent narrative that our elections are not secure and that the 2020 election, is not valid. There's still people a year and a half after the election claiming in certain states, Wisconsin and elsewhere, that there's still the ability to decertify the vote, that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president. And there's efforts afoot that we'll probably talk about to insert essentially election deniers into key positions who will be responsible in upcoming elections for canvassing the vote and for certifying the vote. And so this narrative has then fueled those actors who are actually willing to engage in acts of political violence as the rationale and the reason, and it's given them a veneer of credibility and power, because they feel like they've got agency from others who are proponents of the false narrative. And I think January 6th is, a perfect example of that, but it didn't end there because, and I'm sorry to go on for so long, but if you think about the fraudulent elector scheme and the other schemes that formed the basis of people to believe on January 6th, if they could just stop the counting and, convince Vice President Pence and to reject the legitimate slates of electors from the swing states and instead accept these fraudulent states of electors, they could overrule the will of the people. And so that's where we saw these threats to our democratic processes, the peaceful transition of power, votes actually, counting and determining the outcome marry up with violence.
Our conversation today is framed between two data points. Number one, yesterday, the Department of Homeland Security issued one of their terrorism bulletins, raising concerns that several high-profile events, they refer to the Supreme Court decision, they refer to copycat mass shootings and the upcoming midterms, are events that could be exploited in the service of violence. And tomorrow, the January 6th, the House committee will begin its first public hearings on the events of January 6th. I wanted to ask you, particularly about January 6th. I don't want to get into the committee's work, but 16 months later, has your assessment of what happened that day been altered in any way? Can you sort of help us understand January 6th, 16 months later? Have things gotten worse given what might have happened? Are we at a sort of stasis point? Where are we on this issue?
Yeah, so, I really had thought, I think many of us did, on both sides of the aisle, that January 6th would be sort of a wake-up moment. Like, our democracy really is under threat, and we need to condemn this type of activity and, put it behind us and do better. And that's not at all what we've seen. So if we just go back to January 6th, what we saw there, and we talked about this a little bit last year, is that we saw this confluence of all types of extremists, from militia violent extremists like the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, both groups of which have been charged with seditious conspiracy, among other charges. We saw white supremacists, neo-Confederates. We saw accelerationist groups. Those are those who are trying to accelerate toward a civil war in order to create a white ethno-state. We saw conspiracy theorists, QAnon and other conspiracy theorists, all joined together, putting aside whatever their differences might be on a day-to-day basis, but all joined together in furtherance, again, of this whole stop the steal, of this false narrative of a stolen election. And they were the foot soldiers to really do former President Trump's bidding that day. But they couldn't have really probably done it alone, because what we saw is that because so many people had come out, including people who probably legitimately had doubts about the integrity of the election results. I mean, certainly that's something that had been being said day after day after day by not only the president and his surrogates, but also by, people in the media. And so some who came to the rallies just really to be part of that rally, but they get swept up into what these others who were more radical and more prepared to engage in violence, they got swept up into that mob. That mob became a riot, and you had people who were probably doing things they never intended to do, like, violently assault police officers, break windows, scale the walls of the Capitol, creep in through, windows and doors and ransack the place. So that's why I thought it would be an aha moment. The charges started coming in, arrests, indictments. And I think, it really caused people to step back and realize this isn't role playing. This isn't LARPing. This isn't a video game. This is reality. And what they did was extremely violent and extremely seditious. It was an insurrection. But instead, what we've seen is 16 months now of revisionist history, where we've even got one party, referring to January 6th as though it was just an expression of First Amendment rights to protest and to demonstrate. And, we all have eyes to see the video. We all have ears to hear the video. And there's no one who can look at what happened that day and think that was some sort of peaceful First Amendment protected protest. And on top of that, this notion of a fraudulent election, someone in the White House who shouldn't be there, who didn't actually win, that has been doubled down on by Donald Trump, who to this day still says almost probably every day, probably multiple times a day, that he really won the election. It's been doubled down on by his surrogates. And shamefully, it's been adopted by elected officials, members of Congress, officials in the states who, use their credibility, their power and privilege to propagate this type of false narrative. So rather than January 6th being that wake up moment, it instead has been, I think in some ways, step one along this trajectory of the continued idea that people, that because of, a tyrannical process, which has inserted the wrong person into the White House, they have the right, and in some cases even the duty, to engage in violence in order to correct that result. And, some of the polling out there, I think some is a little bit too dramatic, but some of the polling out there, whatever you look at, shows an alarming number of Americans who believe that violence, may be acceptable in some circumstances. And so that's why, I think as we look over the 16 months, what one would have thought would have really changed the discourse at high levels, which would have trickled down through our media and our social media, and hopefully, started to bring some return to our democratic processes, we've really seen just the opposite.
I asked you back then whether or not January 6th was to draw on an image from American history, was a sort of Lexington and Concord. I think Enrique Tarrio referred to the Winter Palace, storming of the Winter Palace in terms of the Russian Revolution. And it wasn't a video game, but that also goes for the 800 plus people that have been charged. Mm-hmm. And the real question in terms of a chilling impact, this is the largest prosecution in the history of the Department of Justice ever. You've got maybe 840 plus people charged. Vast majority are not going to be charged with felonies, let alone seditious conspiracy. But doing jail time is not a video game. 3-4 years in prison is a certain kind of reality. So I wonder if you could speak to the issue of the organized militias. Are these prosecutions likely to have an impact on 3%ers, Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, as organized forces? I noticed a extraordinary story in the New York Times reported that I think it was the Proud Boys have now participate in the Miami-Dade Republican Executive Committee. They've showed up at school board meetings to protest mask mandates. Has this constrained the organized militia movement in America?
Yeah. So, in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, as the arrests started, being made, there definitely was a lull in activity. For one thing, people quit communicating over social media, right. Went into, private chat rooms, and that had occurred beforehand as well. But there's a lot of things that were available out on open social media. They began laying low because they worried that everything was a honeypot, meaning everything was like a law enforcement operation. And I think it had some sort of immediate impact. But over this course of the last year and a half, they've painted themselves, and others have also been willing to paint them as political prisoners. And you've seen that again from elected officials. You've seen that at rallies. So I think they're using that in a way to recruit and to propagandize and to even feel more emboldened. But the other thing they've done, and I think this is a direct result of trying to do things that will not land them in getting charges, is they've decentralized. And you gave a perfect example with the Miami-Dade, but we're seeing this all over, and we're seeing it actually come from some of the more far right internet platforms. For example, Gab, which a few weeks ago issued on Telegram its strategy, which is focusing on county over country is really the only viable path forward at this point. Yeah. Capture your local county, then several of them, then maybe your state, right? And then ultimately we get to the nation from that. And so that's what we're seeing in many, many places. We are seeing militia members running for elected office. Now, happily in Idaho recently, that didn't go so well for those who were running, but we've seen them run for smaller those were for state level offices where they were a couple of candidates were unsuccessful, but we've seen successful candidacies for things like you mentioned, like school boards and local county officials and election officials. We've seen them spearhead recall efforts of Republican county officials who are not extreme, who are respect law and order and did the right thing. And that's the case, I think, in many, many jurisdictions, is that even for Republicans, if they were not willing to, deny the election and potentially take action in the future to, monkey around with election results, they're getting ousted. And they're getting ousted in many cases by militia members, their supporters, or others who are supported by militias and who are, and the communities are feeling some intimidation and coercion by this. So I think that it is going to take more than these prosecutions to really make a big impact. They will have an impact, and I think if what we have seen so far is that the felony prosecutions so far that have gone to trial have been all successful. They've all resulted in convictions. If I were charged with a felony, I would be getting pretty worried and really, really thinking about cooperating with the government. And I do think we'll be seeing more and more guilty pleas and cooperation agreements as more and more felony trials result in convictions. The seditious conspiracy cases, those are, of course, felonies. They're serious. Historically, the government hasn't always had great success in prosecuting those charges. But I think this is very, very different because historically, they've oftentimes been prosecuted when the thing that was planned, the sedition that they conspired to commit, didn't actually come to fruition because it was thwarted by law enforcement in advance. Here, we saw it. I mean, it happened. They violently attacked the Capitol on January 6th. There's abundant evidence through digital evidence, both, planning communications, post January 6th communications, admitting to what they did, videos, photographs, audio, etc. There's abundant evidence of what their intent was. And so I think these will be very different prosecutions. Again, the impact of that, I think, will not make them go away. It will change their strategy, such as this decentralization strategy.
If paramilitary organizations are barred in all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, how are groups like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys and Three Percenters allowed to operate? Is it with the acquiescence and the enabling of, local law enforcement? Is it because we focus so heavily in the wake of 9/11 on a foreign terrorist threat and not on domestic security? How do you explain the fact that they're able to operate with seeming impunity?
Yeah, I think it's all of those things and a few other things. As you just indicated, that has not been the priority until recently. I mean, we now do have the FBI director, Christopher Wray, for the last couple of years, has been sounding the alarm about domestic extremists and has stated that militia violent extremists are right up there in the top threat, along with white racially motivated extremists when it comes to the most significant threats to the homeland from domestic extremism, more significant even than foreign terrorist organization related threats to the homeland. That hasn't gone away, but just in terms of just the number of cases they have open, the number of investigations, and just the lethality of it. The lethality of it is certainly greater than it is from international terrorist acts committed here in the US. So part of it is it's only been recently that there's been attention given to it at the federal level. Historically, the federal attention happened when we had these armed standoffs against federal agents. Back in the early 90s, Ruby Ridge, Waco, Texas. More recently, the standoffs in Bunkerville, Nevada in 2014, and the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon a couple of years later. But those didn't impact most people, right? That was standoffs about the use of federal lands, militias against the feds, and other people mostly weren't impacted. What's been so dangerous now, and why I think it's getting more attention, is because of their engagement with members of the public. Not only, obviously when they're armed with heavy weaponry that's usually AR-15s and similar types of assault style rifles, not only do they manifest the ability to have incredible firepower and kill people, that results in intimidation or coercion. Whether you're intimidating people who are out exercising their First Amendment rights to protest or demonstrate, whether you're intimidating people who are trying to exercise their rights to participate in democratic processes at their state houses, at their local county level, at their school board meetings, and they're feeling intimidated, of course, whether you're a voter, or whether it's these groups who are actually usurping the role of law enforcement and ordering people around and arrogating to themselves power that they don't have. So these things we're seeing more and more, and so the federal government is starting now, belatedly in my opinion, to focus on it, but we haven't seen that in the past. States are getting more interested. I'm going to be talking to a number of federal, state, and local officials next week in the Great Lakes region. We're going to be talking about these things. But historically, I don't think they've really understood that laws exist that bar this activity. I don't think they've really had a proper understanding of the Second Amendment, because there's been a very concerted effort over the last couple of decades to promote, by those some extremist gun rights absolutists, to promote an understanding of the Second Amendment that is almost limitless, and that is completely contrary to what the Supreme Court has told us, including Justice Scalia writing for the court in 2008 that the Second Amendment is not a right to carry any weapon whatsoever, any place whatsoever, and for whatsoever purpose. And he made it very clear that plenty of different restrictions were completely consistent with text, history, and tradition of the Second Amendment. But that's been very much rewritten in the public eye. And even law enforcement, I have heard say, for example, after the shooting in Kenosha by someone who had joined up with the militia there, well, it was their Second Amendment right. No, it is not their Second Amendment right. So I think another reason, in addition to the lack of priority and focus, is lack of a proper understanding of the Second Amendment. And then another reason is lack of political will. Because, the responsibility for enforcing anti-militia and anti-paramilitary laws generally falls on elected local prosecutors and law enforcement. And if they are in jurisdictions that are, harbor a lot of people with anti-government views, who are Second Amendment absolutists, it's just hard for them to fathom, investigating and prosecuting these violations of people who are their voter base. And that is one reason why I think the federal government really does need to take a bigger role in this. I've worked with Representative Raskin and his staff, as well as others in the Hill, to craft up, some model federal legislation that could potentially fill some of this gap. And these groups don't stay local anyway, right? They travel. They don't always travel, but many of them do. And so it's an interstate issue. One last thing I would say, because I think this is important, is that it can be very dangerous to crack down on groups like this. We're talking about groups that are heavily armed, groups that train in paramilitary tactics, groups that heavily recruit from the military because of their experience with not only firearms and other paramilitary tactics, but incendiary devices. And so, the federal government and state and local governments do have to think about what is the risk to public safety, their own safety, but also public safety, if they are to investigate, crack down, bring charges against these types of private armies. And it is not an insubstantial thing. I mean, we've seen how this can break bad at places like, Ruby Ridge and even at Malheur Wildlife Refuge. And at Bunkerville, it was the feds who ended up stepping back when they had sniper rifles pointed at their heads. So it is a dangerous bit of business.
And a discrete statute on domestic terrorism. I know you've been involved in that issue, isn't going to solve the problem. I want to pick up on something you said. Again, back in March, you coined a term spontaneously, and you called it flash radicalization at the Capitol. The vast majority of the thousands of people who were there probably did not come to do violence. They got caught and swept up in it.
Yep.
Robert Pape, who testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee yesterday or the day before from the University of Chicago, has done statistical research on 800 plus individuals who were arrested and charged. And what's extraordinary about his conclusions is that these people are not fringe. This has moved from the fringe to the mainstream. 90% of those, almost 90% of the 800 plus charged, are middle-class whites residing in counties which showed over the last decade or so loss of the white population share. 25% are business owners, 26% white collar. Nearly 90% of those people are unaffiliated with any militia. And 53% were from counties that Joe Biden won in 2020 and urban areas, Dallas, Houston, San Francisco, New York City, Los Angeles. It's when we talk about moving from the fringe to the mainstream, the big tent that you referred to of radicalization has a much bigger sort of base element of white Americans who are in any number of ways aggrieved or angry about any number of things. And how do you then cope with that group of individuals?
So that's I think what makes this particular time period in history so challenging. You know, Robert Pape's studies are accurate as far as I can tell, but to not being officially affiliated with an extremist group, a militia group, a conspiracy group is very different than not being influenced by the ideology of those groups, particularly as it is accepted by, again, elected officials, people in positions of power with prestige, and members of the media. And the Great Replacement theory, the Stop the Steal ideology, all of these things that fueled, that have been fueling violence, not only on January 6th, but since then, that's consumed by people, including people we think of in the mainstream, right? Who are not members of a group. They're, they don't go join up with their militia and train, but they are consuming through the media and through social media as well, the types of propaganda, the types of, frankly, just lies and disinformation that that sometimes then drives people to do something they wouldn't normally do. And what we saw on January 6th was an example of that. I think probably the vast majority of the people there, if you'd ask them, did you go to the Capitol that day in order to, with an intent to violently enter, would say no, even some who admitted that that's what they ended up doing.
Right.
And maybe they don't intend to ever do anything like that, but that doesn't mean that they aren't harboring these these views that are, except that they're not extreme. They're not, I'll say they're extreme in that they're not based in fact. And they would be extreme were it not for the fact that there are more and more people adopting them and accepting them. And
Right.
so, obviously, we've had horrible times in history. We had a civil war even when we didn't have anything like social media or online media. But I think in today's world, it just makes the ability to propagate disinformation and suggest things like 1776, right? Like it's our right as the people as we the people, as we've seen the Proud Boys say, and in the most recent indictment and previous indictments, to actually take up arms against an oppressive government. That's where that's just kind of growing. And that's a really worrisome thing, because I do think there is, I referenced, video game, and you very rightly said this isn't a video game, and I totally agree. But I sometimes think people aren't fully appreciating that, right? You don't get to just go play insurrectionist on January 6th and go back to your real estate practice the next day and pretend like everything's going to be fine. It doesn't work that way, and the damage to our processes lingers and it stays. And that's where I think we're in a real jam here. And we have got to, first of all, we've got to take seriously the grievances of people who feel vulnerable to things like believing in Great Replacement theory. We need to have ways to be clear that it's not a zero-sum game, right? More equality for all doesn't mean all white people are going to have less. Economists can support this 1,000 times over, and I'm not one, but I've read what they have to say. We all rise up when everyone is given a fair shake, but that's just not the message that's getting through. It's something else that's getting through, and it's going to take. I hope that there are some percentage of persuadable people who are tired of being told what to think and who really want to make decisions for themselves based on facts and evidence, and that those are the people who are going to, be able to come forward and hopefully, help us to continue with our democracy.
Yeah. Is the concept, the Department of Homeland Security Terrorism Bulletin basically said that the primary threat in the months ahead will come from quote unquote lone. I'm not sure even they use the term lone wolf, but that's the term a term of art that's been employed by many people, and small groups. Mm-hmm. Is the notion of the lone wolf an accurate notion? You mentioned You
Yeah,
mentioned
and
me on camera. The only thing that the shooter did alone was shoot.
the shoot, right. And that's just it. I think it's not really accurate. I understand, in this kind of a bulletin why they might write it that way, but I think that is really just, a very small part of the picture, right? Because in all these cases, like look at Buffalo, the Buffalo shooter, it's clear from, his writings, his manifesto that he says, I was basically radicalized online. I spent all my time in online, forums, consuming great replacement theory, consuming other extremist material, and became radicalized, decide to, purchase these weapons and try to kill as many Black people as I could. So he's only lone, like you said, because of the fact that he went by himself to that grocery store. But everything that led up to it took a lot of people and a lot of, a lot of propaganda and disinformation that infected his head. And that's what political violence is oftentimes, right? That's what foreign terrorist organizations do. They distribute, and now ISIS has a leg up where Al-Qaeda didn't. Al-Qaeda didn't have social media and platforms. ISIS does. They were able to very, very quickly recruit, fundraise, propagandize, and get people to travel to Syria to join them, and then ultimately get people to try to, to commit attacks right here in the US and elsewhere around the world, just through radicalization over social media. And it's oftentimes by seeding disinformation, seeding the fact that the West is having a war against Islam and things like that. And the West is the oppressive state. And we're going to have this wonderful state of Sharia law with our own education systems and healthcare systems and our own economy, et cetera. But it was all lies, right? It was a brutal regime. And that's exactly what our domestic extremists are doing as well. And I say domestic, white supremacy does not end at the US borders. This is a global phenomenon, as we know from other terrorist attacks in other places. But we certainly seem to be consuming it in unfortunately large amounts here. And with the numbers of mass shootings we're seeing, and you're right to make the point early in this show that there's still many more other deaths by gun violence than from our mass shootings. Right. But mass shootings are terrorism. They terrorize people. It is crime of violence done to intimidate and coerce and to affect the policy of government through intimidation or coercion. And that's why it is more than just a local public safety threat. It's a national security threat, and now a threat to our democracy.
Right. As we near the end of the 45 minutes, I do want to turn to guns. But I guess let me state the obvious. One would hope raising kids as Lindsay and I did in the 80s and 90s may have been a fundamentally different sort of environment, the way we were raised by our parents. But one would hope that the first line of defense, the first line of awareness, the first line of information about an individual would come from family, from friends, schoolmates, teachers. Has there been, how do you account for the anonymity of shooters who are living in houses with their parents, talking to their friends online, to be sure? Am I being too idealized to expect that parents, relatives, and friends should, I guess, be exposed to clues and awareness of a disturbed individual? What is it? Or is it just in a general population, you're going to end up with individuals and families that are dysfunctional and are outliers and don't have these safety checks?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, so I'm not really qualified to answer this. I can say that, studies have shown in interviews with people who have been convicted of, terrorist attacks here in the US, that there was some person in their life who thought something was wrong and didn't say something. It could be a family member, it could be a teacher, it could be a coach, you know, or a religious leader, and too few of them step forward. And I think partly that's sometimes because a person is afraid of sicking the FBI on their loved one, right? I mean, they don't really want that to happen. But I also think people probably live in denial. You know, I mean, I have kids who are now in their early 20s. And if I were to start to see suspicious things, I would like to think that I would be smart enough to do something about it. But I can imagine my brain rationalizing, that's not really real. They don't really mean that. We'll have a conversation about, you know, it's not right to joke about that stuff, right? People, I think, want to rationalize away that anything could be as dire as committing a mass shooting. Some of the young women who were talking to the shooter in Uvalde over social media said, I didn't think he would do it, but that's just it, right? So many of us say, I didn't think he would do it. I thought it was a joke. This comes back to my living in a video game, right? We're not living in a video game. Some of these things aren't just jokes.
All right. I mean, in 5 minutes, we're not going to come up with recommendations that are going to solve the gun problem in America. But I mean, the majority of Americans, roughly 100 a day, are killed with guns, either homicides or suicides. They don't constitute the 1% of mass shootings. And we have well-intentioned Republican and Democratic senators and House members busy at work on legislation. I gather that it's not going to be the deep end of the pool in terms of how to restrict, restrain, and deal with the proliferation of assault rifles. And I mean, we don't have to rehearse all this. I want to ask you, though, again, on the psychology. I know you're not a sociologist, psychologist, but I think this is important. Somebody asked me the other day what I remember about the most deadly shooting in American history. Okay? All I could remember was that it occurred in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. All right? It was October 2nd, 2012. It was at the 91 Root Harvest Music Festival. 60 Americans were killed, 850 were wounded. And yet I could not recall more than that. Mm-hmm. And I think our capacity to remember and to process this is limited. We are becoming, and again, I'm just reporting here. It's tragic and it's terrible. I don't have an answer. We're becoming inured to these things. Mm-hmm. The Washington Post ran a piece based on some Gallup polling. The average grief cycle for an American observing these things is 4 days. So I don't know how you, I mean, there's no answer to this, how you penetrate the conscious. I thought after Newtown,
me too,
things would fundamentally change. Well, they didn't. They got worse. Yeah. Legislation, clearly, we live in a republic. Legislation is critically important. It's just realistically, I see nibbling around the edges, however significant what Congress may produce may be in comparison to not doing anything. Mm-hmm. But I just wonder, in terms of what your own view is of gun control writ large, particularly with respect to automatic weapons.
Yeah. So, you know, I, like you and so many Americans, thought Sandy Hook would be the time we got actual gun safety legislation. I mean, if we're talking about killing elementary school children, what line could be worse? And it wasn't enough. And we've seen multiple school shootings since then, and Uvalde is elementary school children again. And so I do think we're near to it. But I think one of the problems also is that gun rights are now just associated with, you know, I'm a good Republican and I've got to be in favor of this absolutist view of gun rights. And there is a fear to take any other position. I mean, the representative in New York from Buffalo who said he was going to vote for gun safety legislation was immediately pressured into taking, you know, into
within a week, he declared he was not going to seek re-election.
Right. And so even though the polls show the majority of people, including Republicans, favor reasonable gun safety legislation, we can debate what that means. Personally, I think we should ban all assault style rifles, but I get it that that's probably not going to happen right now. despite the fact that the majority, they're not the ones apparently with the power. They're not the ones bankrolling campaigns. They're not the NRA or the gun rights organizations that are even more to the right of the NRA that are putting even more pressure on our elected officials. And so elected officials right now are just like feeling, in my opinion, beholden to this absolutist gun rights lobby. And until that changes, that dynamic, which is tough because the Supreme Court has, really, on its First Amendment rulings with respect to corporations and organizations, has taken a really hard stand there. But until that changes, I think we're in a real difficult time to get anything other than just nibbling around the edges done. And that is completely unsatisfactory. Our numbers are, off the charts in comparison to other countries. And it's, we're killing ourselves.
Mary, I want to thank you. I was depressed before this session. Now I'm thoroughly, but it's not true. Just describing the nature of the problem is critically important to even beginning to address it. And as far as I'm concerned, you're a national resource and a national asset. And I really want to thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. For all those who are listening to Carnegie Connects, stay tuned. June 15th, I'll sit down with David Petraeus for a discussion of Ukraine, American foreign policy, and also challenges at home. So, McCord, thanks again. You were terrific. Truly appreciate it. Take care.
Take care.